Go live. And looks like we're live. Great. Well, thank you everyone who's joining us on Facebook or YouTube to talk about the new Pew study on American Jews. I'm Arno Rosenfeld. I'm a reporter at The Forward, and I'm joined by Alan Cooperman, who is Director of Religion Research at Pew Research Center, who oversaw the creation of this nearly 250-page report that came out yesterday. And we're just going to talk a little bit about the report. Is there any more background you want to give, Alan, on your role at Pew? Or, I'm sure a lot of work went into this report, but
a lot of work went into the report. We've been working on it for a few years, but it was also a great pleasure. I'm sorry, it's 248 pages, but wanted to be thorough, and I'm sure there are many things that still somehow didn't make it into 248 pages, and the FAQ and all that. It's all freely available on our website, no charge. Just go there, pewresearch.org. And of course, there's great reporting on it at The Forward, theforward.com. Right, Arno?
So. That's right. Yep. And we can put some of the links to our coverage and to the report in the chat if you're watching on Facebook. Well, I guess I do want to ask, because this is a tough week to release Jewish news with everything that's going on in Israel kind of dominating the news cycle. So could you talk a little bit about how long this report was in the works for? I assume you didn't decide, on Monday to release it on Tuesday. So when did the work get started on this?
Really, the work goes back 3+ years. We pulled together a large group of sociologists, demographers, political scientists from all over the United States, Israel, the UK, et cetera, on the 5th anniversary of the 2013 study. So it was 2018, and we had a public event, and then we gathered kind of our workshop to start thinking about the next study. So that was 3 years ago. We went into the field with the study it was the fall of 2019. And the study came out of the field in June of 2020, and we've been working on it for months. And the release date was set, weeks and weeks ago, and it was sent out to reporters under embargo. So we really couldn't change the release date. And I might have seemed insensitive, and I'm very sorry for that. Don't mean to be insensitive. And the events in Israel and Palestine are obviously tragic.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we will get in a little bit about what we've learned about American Jews and their relationship to Israel, which was in the report a little bit later on. But I wanted to start with one of the most striking things that I think you identified in the report, and that, I covered and has been written about by other outlets, which is the divergence among young Jews, 18 to 29, and soaring numbers of Orthodox Jews within that age group. So I think something like 3% of Jews over the age of 65 identify as Orthodox, 17%. It ticks steadily up through the age group. 17%, 18 to 29 identify as Orthodox. And then, of course, there's also an increasing number. There are fewer identifying as conservative and reform, and more identifying as, unaffiliated with a particular branch. So that's a big divergence in terms of religious observance. I'm curious how you measured that, because there's been a little bit of pushback from people who look at that and say it seems like an outlier, and they have some theories about why that might be. Why are you confident that that is a pretty accurate number?
Well, it's a broad pattern, and you see it in lots of different things. It's not any one particular number. I mean, the big picture, Arno, is that if you kind of array Jews on a spectrum, and there's definitely a spectrum. There's a spectrum of observance, of traditionalism, of engagement. But if you put Jews on those spectrums and array them, what you'll see is that as you get to younger age cohorts, that there's growth at both kind of polar ends of the spectrum. So if we're thinking of it as first and foremost a religious spectrum, though that's not the whole picture, but that's part of the picture. As you started to say, there's growth among at the younger Jews, the share who are highly traditionally observant, not just Orthodox, but Haredi, in fact. And then there's also growth at the low end, among the most secular share. So the share of younger Jews who are highly secular is also higher than among older Jews, as is the share who are highly observant. But that's not the only spectrum. You can think of this as a spectrum of engagement, including in non-religious ways. And you'll also find that the younger group is more it's gotten more people at both ends and fewer in the middle. I mean, big picture, one of the interesting things about Jews. So we study at Pew Research Center. We don't just study Jews. I mean, maybe Jewish audiences think somehow we're the Jewish Research Center, but most of our studies are of religion in general.
Not about Jews.
Around the world. And one of the things that's interesting about Jews is that historically in the United States and in our data, Jews have been a kind of moderately religious group. So a classic example of that is that the share of American Jews who go to religious services on a weekly basis is lower than the share of all Americans who say they go to religious services on a weekly basis. But there's a big number of American Jews, bigger than in the general population, who go to religious services just a few times a year. That's great. That's fine. There's sort of this moderate kind of, expression of Jewishness, moderate in the sense of it isn't weekly, but it's there. But among younger Jews, there's this sort of, we call it divergence, so as not to use the political polarization term. But that's also another spectrum, is political polarization. And what you see is that, Orthodox Jews today lean as strongly Republican as Jews as a whole lean Democratic. And that's true for younger Orthodox Jews as well as older Orthodox Jews, though we really don't have the sample size to separate out younger and older. But my point is that all these different ways of looking at Jews, it's not one particular number. It's not just that, we come up with 17% of 18 to 29-year-olds who are Orthodox. If you told me it was 15%, it wouldn't change the pattern. Whether that pattern is 15% or 17% or 19%, it's the overall pattern. And by the way, we saw that pattern in the 2013 study. I mean, there were definitely signals of this coming through. And frankly, anybody who's familiar with Jewish life, I think it's going to register with them. The orthodoxy is very vibrant and growing in American life, as is, frankly, versions of secular or cultural Judaism. And we're not, it's not our business to lament that. We're not saying there's anything wrong with that. We're just trying to present a picture of it. It does portend this kind of divergence over time. And one other way of thinking about it is that in some ways it's similar to the way that many people may think about, and some of the reality, at least, of Israeli life, because we've also done surveys and studies of the Jewish population and the broader population in Israel. And as many American Jews know, the Israeli Jewish population is really highly segmented. And the Hiloni, or secular part of the population, which is huge in Israel, very vibrantly Jewish, but very secularly Jewish, is very different from the Orthodox and especially the Haredi population, which is also large. So in some ways, and I don't want to overstate this, but in some ways, you can look at some of the patterns in the Pew study and at least raise the question for yourself whether the American Jewish community is beginning to look a little more, I'm not saying we're there yet, but beginning to look a bit like the Israeli Jewish community, with some of those strong divisions internally in terms of what it means to be Jewish, and kind of a, potentially at least, some sociologists say, a hollowing out of the Jewish middle. I'm not sure we see, I'm not out there claiming that there's a hollowing out of the middle.
Right. I mean, I think there's also the concept of assimilation looks much different in Israel, because if you sort of leave the faith and become just sort of the default societal religion, you're likely still Jewish. But it is interesting to see those patterns. And point taken that it is about the patterns. I do, I'm not being a statistician, I thought it was interesting that we see this kind of upward curve among Orthodox through the age groups, but that the Orthodox population was pretty steady between the 2013 study and the 2021 study. So how does that work? How can you have each age group of Orthodox, more share of the population is identifying as Orthodox, but the population overall doesn't appear to be increasing?
Well, in part because of exactly the pattern we're talking about, because the share who are secular is also increasing by younger age. So if you just had an increase in the Orthodox and not a commensurate increase on the other side of the equation, then the overall picture might be different. But there are a few things going on. And look, it's only been 7 years. And 7 years is not a lot of change, not a lot of time to see this change. The other thing is we're talking about a small part of a very small population. Now, I know, if you live in New York City or some parts of New York City, it seems like there are Jews everywhere. But in the US population, Jews are, from a statistical point of view, a rare population. They're only about 2% of the US population. And now we're talking about a subgroup that's 10% of that 2%. So you're talking about trying to measure in a national survey a group that is 0.2% of the US population. And even in a study that's designed to focus in on the Jewish population, and we can get into this, the study doesn't start as a study of Jews. This study starts with a broad sample of the US population. So the ability to drill down into a group this small with such precision to be able to say with 1 percentage point or 2 percentage points, this group is this much bigger, that much bigger than it was in 2013. It's just really stretching what we can do. And frankly, it's not the right way to look at a survey like this to say, 1 percentage point is a real difference. It's not. You were absolutely right when you said the numbers in 2013 and the numbers in 2020, big picture for the composition of the Jewish population, that is the share who identify as Orthodox, conservative, reform, with no particular branch or other branches like Reconstructionist or Humanistic Judaism, those are all really pretty similar. So the way I'd say it is you've got a kind of basic level of stability. At the same time, you have some signs of potential change going on below the surface. And that's the reality of it. I wish that our surveys and other surveys could really be accurate to pick up, tiny percentages of the US population. But we got to have some humility about that. And we also have to have some realism in viewers of people understanding the data. We try hard in our report to explain this so that people aren't, casting about in the shadows to try to find little differences and then think that they're real.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a bit about the methodology. I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but I do, think it's important because, of course, the Pew study it's not just that you ask a lot of questions. I think it's also recognized that it's sort of the gold standard of religion research in the United States. There are a lot of surveys that come out where some organization will poll 500 or 1,000 people who have identified themselves as Jewish, and we'll say, okay, now we can do either an exit poll or a poll about Israel or something like that. I understand to get to this study, you reached out to something like 65,000 people originally by mail. Can you talk about sort of how you went about identifying the group of people who you actually wanted to take the full survey and how that was different from what you did in 2013?
Sure, absolutely. So there are a lot of cheaper and ways potentially to try to do a survey of American Jews, but you're right. We set out to do the best possible survey, and it's expensive and it's difficult. And it starts not with lists of Jews who are synagogue members or other Jewish organizations or distinctive Jewish names or anything like that. It's a survey. We're focusing in on a report on Jewish Americans, but it starts out as a survey of the general public. So the way we did it in 2013 was by telephone, randomly dialing telephone numbers of hundreds of thousands of people and asking them some screening questions. And if they indicated they were Jewish in one way or another, then they went on to a longer interview. That's how we did it in 2013. But responses to telephone surveys have dropped tremendously. And while telephone surveys can still be done and still generate good data, that's no longer the best way to do a really high quality study like this that's trying to drill down into a very small part of the population. So instead, the way we did it, the term of art is called address-based sampling. And basically it starts with the US Postal Service's master computerized list of all the residential addresses in the United States. And we take that list, we stratify the country geographically, and we send letters to randomly selected addresses all across the country, all 50 states and the District of Columbia, not seeking, not Jewish addresses, but US residential addresses. And we, we enclose a little pre-incentive, literally $1 bill or two $1 bills in these first letters. And we ask the recipients to get them to either fill out a small screening interview on paper and mail it back to us in a self-addressed envelope. Or first and foremost, we try to get them to go online to a secure website where they introduce a particular number that's on their letter, and we can track them as individual respondents. I'm going to slightly oversimplify the whole process because it goes on and on. We try to recontact those we don't hear from, et cetera. But basically, again, we start out with this massive sample. Now, you said 65,000. Actually, we completed screening interviews with 68,000 people all across the country. That's completed. So we reached out to many more than that. Our total response rate of all the people we attempted to reach, we ended up reaching about 17% and actually completing full interviews with about 17% of the ones we tried to reach. They first would do this screening interview, and if they qualified as Jewish in some way, or kind of in one of these categories that's sort of close to Jewish in the sort of the penumbra of Jewishness, the shadows of Jewishness in any way, then they got the longer survey. And again, they could fill it out on paper with a pen or pencil and mail it back to us, or they could do it online. So it didn't have to be online to be able to do this. Okay, so how then did we filter down? Well, in that set of screening questions, the screening interview, the first questions aren't about Jewishness. One of the things you don't want to do in something like this is sort of give people the impression that you're seeking Jews. So actually, the variety of questions starts out with some sort of now questions about how things are going in your life, and actually some substantive questions that are really quite interesting to whatever, but they aren't really critical to the screening process. The critical questions come sort of somewhere in the middle there. And one of them is, what is your present religion, if any? And there's a variety of different answers that are response options that are offered, and Jewish is in there somewhere. And anybody who says their religion is Jewish, they're included. We then ask them to take the longer survey. But in addition to that, we also have a screening question that says, okay, aside from religion, do you consider yourself Jewish in any way? In any way, such as by ancestry, culture, or because of your family background. And anyone who said they consider themselves Jewish in any way, could be because they're married to someone who's Jewish, could be because their daughter or son married someone who's Jewish, or their mother or father remarried someone who's Jewish. All different kinds of reasons. Whatever that reason is, if you said you consider yourself Jewish in some way, you get the longer survey. And then there's a third group, and that's a third screening question, and that is, did you have a Jewish parent, or were you raised Jewish? And if the people said yes to that, they also got the full extended interview. So all those people are potentially, we have data on all those people. When we actually come down to analyze people and to present to the public, here's what American Jews think, and here's what American Jews have experienced. We have to make some analytical decisions. And for example, someone who tells us that their current religion is Christianity, even if they had a Jewish parent, we didn't include them in the main Jewish category. So they're not included in numbers for here's what American Jews say, here's what American Jews think. Again, we have data on those people, and they're analyzed in the report. But if they were raised Jewish or had a Jewish parent, but today they consider themselves Christians or Muslims or any other religion, then they're in a different category. They're in the people of Jewish background. And then similarly, there are people who were raised Jewish or have a Jewish parent, but they're not Jewish by religion today, and they tell us they do not consider themselves Jewish in any way. In answer to that second question, nope, I do not consider myself Jewish in any way. Nope, my religion is not Jewish. They did say that they had a Jewish parent or they were raised Jewish. Again, we don't include, if they tell us it's not their religion, they don't consider themselves Jewish anyway, we don't include them. So there are those analytical decisions. Again, I've got in the report, there's a kind of a decision tree that'll show you a graphic to try to give you because it is a little bit complicated. The big picture for people to understand, though, is that this report and this analysis is not just about people who consider Judaism to be their religion. We've gone to great lengths to have an expanded definition of who counts as Jewish, and to count in that definition people who aren't Jewish by religion, as long as they don't have any other religion. Okay, so they're not Jewish, or they're not religious maybe at all, but they do consider themselves Jewish in other ways, and they are included. They are included in the Jewish population. Now, we also, you can look in the data and see it broken down in lots of different ways. And one of the ways that we often break down the data is you can see those who identify with the Jewish religion versus those in the broader category. But they are included in lots of different ways. I mean, you can also look at women, you can look at younger versus older, you can look at people who live in one part of the country versus another, and so on and so forth. Lots of different.
And that idea of sort of Jews not by religion, I was going to ask, is that something that you also ask on when you do studies of, Catholics in America or Muslims? Do you also try and capture that, or is it a uniquely Jewish question?
It's pretty much a uniquely Jewish thing. I mean, you can't be Presbyterian aside from religion. It doesn't even make sense. Right. You consider yourself Methodist aside from religion. Now, you could maybe be, there's some categories, there may be some things close. Like, I think Greek Orthodox is pretty close because, note, it's got the Greek element in it. So there are people, I have a good friend who's Greek Orthodox, not very religious, but he was raised in Greek Orthodoxy. And I think his kind of view of Greek Orthodoxy is not so different from some American Jews who are sort of cultural Jews. There's some things that are close, but it's I don't think it has an exact, I don't think there's any other religious group that's exactly the same. Having said that, though, by the way, we did do a survey of Catholics some years ago, and we asked people sort of a question like that. Do you consider yourself Catholic aside from religion? And we drilled into that, and we did have, so we've done some similar things with some other groups. And in fact, among the screening questions, that screening survey, the first initial survey that we asked about, we asked people whether they consider themselves Jewish aside from religion. We also asked whether they consider themselves Catholic aside from religion, Muslim aside from religion, or Mormon aside from religion. Mormon is also an interesting group. There's kind of a group of Mormons in the United States who are sort of lapsed Mormons, but Mormonism is a pretty strong thing, and so a lot of them have strong Mormon upbringing. So they kind of think about themselves as cultural Mormons. So there are some groups that are, kind of similar, but nothing exactly the same. Jewishness is very much historically a matter not just of religion, but also of peoplehood, and Jews get this. And I'm not sure others necessarily understand it about American Jews, that we're both a people and a religion. And in fact, even Jews who identify with the religion will very often, we see this in the survey, they'll tell us that their Jewishness is more a matter of culture or ancestry than it is religion, or certainly that it's not just a matter of religion. And that's really not quite the same for, I think, pretty much any other religious group in the United States.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I know some other surveys, even ones that are shorter, especially like political surveys around the election, did a similar thing. And you would see the difference between the ones that just asked, what's your religion, and filtered in Jews, and which ones had that second question that, aside from religion, are you Jewish? So
there are very few studies that do that second thing, and political studies generally don't. And, one issue is that if you do it for Jews, then you're sort of messing up the rest of the survey in a way, because you're counting Jews potentially twice. You're counting people whose religion isn't Jewish then as Jewish, but then you're taking them out from other religious group. So there's a kind of apples and oranges thing here. Very few political studies look at that second category of second or third or fourth or whatever, those additional categories or ways of being Jewish. Big reports like this, or big studies like this, frankly, are hard to do. They're very expensive, and they're pretty few and far between, though there was one done in 1970, of course, nationally, as people probably know. And then there were the National Jewish Population Studies in 1990 and 2000, and then the Pew 2013 study, and now this study.
Well, I think, I was thinking, yeah, certainly in terms of anything comprehensive, I think the folks who do try and add that extra question to political surveys are liberal, democratic, Jewish groups, because if you only look at Jews by religion, and this bears out, I think, in the Pew data, it will skew conservative. And so the conservative groups will not ask that question, and which is interesting.
It'll skew more conservative.
Yes,
Jews by religion as a whole are still a liberal-leaning group. But it'll be more conservative than it would be if you included this other category to which we've appended this not very lovely. We didn't make it up. This name, Jews of no religion. Don't blame me for it. It's a sociological term. It's been around for decades. It's not the most beautiful term. We used it in 2013, so we use it again in 2020.
Yeah, that's fair, but good to mention, because I know people. I mean, I think it's a funny term, but I'm sure some people chafe at it a little bit. In terms of sort of the categories of Jews, one area that it seemed like more questions were asked this year was around diversity, and sort of getting kind of like the ethnic makeup of the Jewish community. And we wrote about that in our article, as have others. But notably the term Jew of color or Jews of color, which is sort of in the discourse around all these things, was absent from the survey. You were not saying, do you identify as a Jew of color? And I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that, that choice. Why not use that language?
Well, when we were devising the survey questionnaire, it did come up a little bit, kind of at the end, as to whether we should ask people, do they consider themselves Jews of color? And actually, we reached out to a bunch of experts on this around the country, and most people didn't think it was a good idea to ask that question. Among other things, it's a term that's relatively new, and it would be confusing, or potentially could be confusing to a lot of people, as they might not know what it is we're really trying to ask, and you don't want to define something like that in this survey. So I'm sort of mixed minds. It would have been cool if we'd asked it. I would love to ask it in a future survey. I think more surveys will begin to ask it as it becomes a term that more and more people are familiar with. But asking people about unfamiliar terms is, unless you can define the term, is not a good survey practice. So in point of fact, at the end of the day, we did not ask a question. We did not say, do you consider yourself a person of color or a Jew of color? And so we don't know who would and wouldn't identify with that particular term. What we did was we asked a bunch of the racial ethnic categories that are basically modeled on the way the US Census asks about these things, and that are sort of part of America's common political discourse. And by no means are these the best possible categories. Anybody who knows anything knows they're completely artificial categories. They're obviously not biological categories, et cetera, et cetera. But they're important categories in American life, and people are broadly familiar with them. And so we asked people, do they consider themselves white, Black, Hispanic, Asian, et cetera. And we've analyzed those in the fairly standard way. And those model, or they map on very close to the way that the US Census Bureau asks about these things. We didn't go into a lot of the detail of various types of Pacific Islanders and indigenous peoples, because there aren't large numbers of those in the Jewish population, but the categories were there as well. So anyway, roughly speaking, in 2020, 92% of Jewish Americans overall identify as white and non-Hispanic. And there's about 4% who identify as Hispanic, 1% approximately who identify as Black, about 3 percentage points who identify with other non-white races, including Asian or multiracial. So altogether, you've got about 8 percentage points who identify in non-white ways, and so that's interesting, and that compares with only 6% in 2013. And then I think what's really important, you asked this question earlier, sort of surface stability, because 6%, 8%, that's not much of a difference. But below the surface, when we look at this by age, again, you see a really striking pattern, which is among younger Jews, it's 15% who identify with the various non-white categories. And you can also look at, since we also asked this question, not just of the respondents, but when we did the sort of household roster, all the other adults and children in your household, and we also asked that question about this time about, we asked about the race and ethnicity of everybody living in Jewish households. And of course, not everybody living in Jewish households is necessarily Jewish. That's an obvious point.
Right,
but
right.
we do have the data on that. And so 17% of Jewish adults in the United States today tell us that they live in a household in which at least one other person, adult or child, identifies with, according to the respondent, identifies with a non-white category: Black, Hispanic, Asian, Indigenous, etc. And among younger Jewish adults, those ages 18 to 29, it rises close to 30%. If I remember off the top of my head, I think it's 29%. Say that there's someone in their household in one of those categories. So we see among the U.S. Jewish population really interesting signs of increasing racial and ethnic diversity, just as we see in the U.S. population. As everybody knows, the U.S. population is becoming more diverse as well. And then on top of that, Arno, you can layer on other aspects of diversity. So you can layer on sexual orientation, and you'll see it's around 10% of Jewish Americans altogether who identify as gay or lesbian or bisexual. And that rises also among younger Jews. It's higher than that. And then you can layer on other things. Immigrant status, we have that, not where people were born and where their parents were born. And there are the kind of traditional Jewish categories, Ashkenazi, Sephardi, Mizrahi, sort of categories of heritage or the customs, liturgy, among other things, that people follow. And there's about 7% altogether of American Jewish adults who identify as Sephardi or Mizrahi, either entirely or in part. Of course, the majority identify as Ashkenazi. The second largest number say none of those categories is kind of relevant to them, or they don't know. But that's a pretty, 7%. And then we take some trouble, it's sort of in the back of the report, take some pains to kind of try to show how these things layer onto each other, or you could think of it this way, the intersectionality. And we do that particularly the intersectionality between race, ethnicity, sort of the way Americans think about race, ethnicity, Jewish heritage categories, again, Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, and country of birth. And so you can see in various ways, it's like this. We want the data to be useful. And so imagine you're the administrator of a Jewish service organization or a Jewish school or even a non-Jewish school, but you want to kind of evaluate not only Jews, but kind of the diversity of your Jewish population. This would give you some benchmarks or some sense of what levels there are of diversity in the Jewish population by all these different measures.
Makes sense. Well, I have two more questions, and then if anybody who's watching has questions of their own, feel free to put them in the chat on Facebook, and we will try and answer them. But I wanted to talk about one other sort of term that is very popular in the discourse, so different than Jew of color, but another distinctive term, which is BDS. And BDS, for those who aren't familiar, is this movement sort of came out of Palestinian civil society groups, a call to boycott Israel. People differ on what the ultimate goal of the movement is, but basically it's over complaints around occupation and human rights abuses. So it stands for boycott, divest, sanction. And you asked folks if they had heard of it, and also whether they supported it or opposed it strongly, not strongly. And I'm curious how you went about asking folks, did you define it? Did you just say, BDS? Because, and there are also folks who've talked about Zionist BD, like boycotting the settlements, but not the rest of Israel. So how did you frame the question to people? And then I was surprised to see that, only roughly half of American, a little more than half of American Jews were familiar with it, which seemed low given that this is such a kind of hot topic for people who are engaged in stuff around Israel. So how did you go about asking the question? And then, what did you see in the results?
Yeah, so in a way, you answered the question yourself, because when you said about talking about BDS, you had to give a big, long explanation of what it is, and somebody out there is going to disagree with the way you portrayed it. I mean, they're going to say you're too harsh or too whatever, one way or another.
No doubt, yes.
So we didn't try to do that. We didn't try to define it or tell people about it or whatever. We simply said, have you heard about, or how much have you heard about the movement called BDS, Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions? End of question. And people could tell us they'd heard a lot, some, not much, nothing at all. And if they told us they'd heard not much or nothing at all, we said that's it, no follow-up. If they said they'd heard some, at least some, or a lot about it, then we simply said, and do you support it? Strongly support, oppose it, strongly oppose it. So that was it. We didn't define it. We didn't provide any further information other than the name, and we gave the name exactly as the organization gives its own name on its website, et cetera. Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions, Movement, BDS. We provided no additional information about it in any way. And that's a very standard way for Pew Research Center to do this. And then when we give when we report the responses, we report them, so to speak, based on all. That is, we don't report just, say, 50 some percent or whatever, I don't remember the exact number, what share who said they'd heard some or all about it, some or a lot about it. Then they got asked whether they support it. So then we didn't just report, okay, of that share, what said they support it. We report the share of the total Jewish population, including those who said they heard nothing about it. We make it clear, and it's really spelled out quite, I think, clearly in the back of the report. And yes, it's it's only about half of American Jews who say they've even heard of this thing. Among those who have, it's about 10% who say that they support it or strongly support it, and the vast majority say they oppose it or strongly oppose it. And then, there are big differences by Jewish stream, by partisanship, et cetera. You can look at all that data.
Yeah, and I know some other polls have seemed to try and gauge more of the interest level in, say, boycotting Israel. So they say, would you support a boycott of Israel over X issue? And those yield different numbers than this, which seemed really targeted to the sort of existing political movement and whether or not people support that.
People take different approaches to polling, but we're a nonpartisan, non-advocacy polling organization or research center, and we do more things than polling, of course. But generally speaking, we try not to supply people with information that they then just feed back to us. In other words, if you define something, you're giving people cues, which they then feed back to us. Now, definitions are sometimes useful and need to be put in a survey. I'll give you an example of something that we did define. I talked about it a moment ago. Sephardi, Ashkenazi, Mizrahi. We defined Ashkenazi as following the Jewish customs of Central and Eastern Europe, and we defined Sephardi as following the Jewish customs of Spain, and we defined Mizrahi as following the Jewish customs of the Middle East. There are times when a simple definition can be useful, but to define something that's controversial and then try to measure opinion about it, well, the way you've defined it is, you're giving cues that you're then going to get back. So this kind of have you heard about it is the same way that we would, it's the same way that Pew Research Center would back in the day have polled about, say, Obamacare. We would have said, have you heard about President Obama's, whatever we would put it, initiative on healthcare? How much have you heard about it? And then, do you support it? Do you oppose it? We wouldn't have a long paragraph that explains here's the legislation and this is what it would do, and then what do you oppose or support? Because again, then you're getting back what you give to the people to poll on.
Yeah, no, and I don't envy your job, because even on that, right, whether you call it Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act, all of these things are very charged. So.
And we did test that, of course, and very different attitudes toward Obamacare and the Affordable Care Act. Interesting.
Right.
Yeah, all those things. Yeah.
There you go. Well, the last question I wanted to ask is going back to methodology. I'm curious whether, because I can think of a few in my head. One scholar I spoke to about the Orthodox number said that when you're sending letters to folks, you may find more young Orthodox people between 18 and 29 because they've established families, they have jobs. Whereas if you're, more liberal, less observant, you might be on a gap year in Europe or in college without a permanent address or something like that. So that, reaching out to people by mail might yield a different sample than reaching out to people by telephone. That was his hypothesis. So I'm curious whether you had to correct for or identify, if you saw any differences that you think you could attribute to how you reached people, like people who are more likely to respond to a letter than who would have answered the phone in 2013. Did that come up at all?
Yeah, so this is complicated, but let me try to make it simple. You've all heard about weighting of surveys, WEIGHT, the weighting. And one of the things that any sample is going to have some natural randomness to it, and may not be representative, even if you've taken it randomly, of the full population. You might have more men, fewer women, or more younger people and fewer older people, or a lot of times surveys skew toward more highly educated people because they're more likely to respond. And so weighting has to come into play. And weighting is ultimately really important to make a survey representative of the broader population. Now, again, I said right from the get-go, Arno, this did not start out as a survey of the Jews. It started out as a survey of the general population. So we weighted all those 68,000 screening interviews to be like the overall general population in the parts of the country where those interviews were done, where those letters went out. And so even if the sample itself skewed initially toward people with higher levels of education, you're going to weight down the people with higher levels of education. You're going to weight up those with lower levels of education so that the survey is representative of the general US public in terms of levels of education. And ditto with gender, ditto with race and ethnicity, ditto with a bunch of other factors. And of course, with geographic distribution as well. And then for the Jewish population, this is very complicated how to do the weighting here. But we also had models that we used using the data from within the survey to do some weighting of the Jewish population. In the end, nothing's perfect, but we do believe that the sample that we have is representative. Both of the subsample of Jews is representative of the Jewish population, and the sample that we have for the broader American population is representative of the broader American population. And at the same time that and effectively I'm asking you to trust me on that, there's a long methodology statement in the report. You can read it. You can follow the math too. It's all in there, the equations and everything else, and how this is done. And you can talk with experts. And it's not that it is at some level it's rocket science, but at some level it's not. Sampling is done all the time. We know that it is accurate because we have benchmarks that we can use. So we know for the general US population what share of people are smokers, what share of people are registered to vote. We have tremendous federal data from censuses and other sources, and we can do our surveys and ask those questions and weight the data according to the demographic characteristics and see how close we come to those benchmarks. And that's it. We don't have to wait every 4 years to see whether we can predict a presidential election. We can do this kind of benchmarking on a more regular basis, and frankly, a better basis. And it works. Look, surveys. If you don't believe in surveys, I'm not going to persuade you. But it's a science. It's also an art. At the same time, I say all that, I'm the last one to try to pretend that surveys have a degree of precision that they don't. And certainly, the difference between the 2013 study, which was done by telephone, and the 2020 study, which was done We call it a self-administered survey. Whether people took it online or on paper, there's no live interviewer. Those are two very different things. They're psychologically very different. And also the way that people respond to things that are read to them versus the way they respond to something written, two different things. So an important part of this study, an additional reason why this is complicated, is that we did a whole large parallel experiment, what we call a mode study. And there's an appendix of the report that goes into this in great detail, but we took a separate sample, not a representative sample, by the way, a sort of a flagged sample of American Jews, people for whom we had addresses and telephone numbers. And we randomly, none of these people are included in the main study. Okay? It's totally separate, but it is a parallel study. Half of those people were randomly assigned to be interviewed by telephone, and half were randomly assigned to fill out a survey by themselves, either on paper or online, their choice. And then we compare the results, and those two groups are weighted to be similar in terms of age, gender, occupation, et cetera, education, et cetera. Then we compare those results, and we can see how people answer some questions differently when they're talking with a live person on the telephone than they do when they're filling out something by themselves. And it's actually quite different. And attitudes toward Israel are one of the things, for example, that are quite different. There's a lot of social desirability is the sort of the term of art for this. And when someone's speaking to a live interviewer, they're more likely to indicate higher levels of emotional attachment to Israel, at least American Jews are, than if they're filling out a survey by themselves. So there are some ways in which the 2020 data are not directly comparable to the 2013 data. In fact, many ways in which they're not comparable. And we go kind of out of our way in the report to explain this and to caution people. Even though we asked many questions, exactly the same questions in 2013 and 2020, you can't sort of line up the two studies and assume, I mean, you can line them up, but you should not line them up and assume that those differences represent real change over time. Sort of there's a better way to do it, think about it, which is to look at the broader patterns and see whether the broader patterns are the same over time. And if they are, it can give you also more confidence that this is something that's true and real. Because even with two different methods, two different sets of time, we find similar patterns. Give you one of those patterns, which is that younger Jews tend to be less emotionally attached to Israel than older Jews, and in some ways less positive about Israel than older Jews. And many studies have found that it's right. It's a strong finding. We have a lot of confidence in it.
Right, makes sense. All right. Well, I think those were all the questions that I had. Sure.
I know some of your audiences, some of your viewers are concerned about this on the methodology thing. I just kind of want to say regretfully and apologize that we asked the gender question in this survey in a binary form: are you male or female? And since the summer of last year, since the summer of 2020, it has no longer been standard at the Pew Research Center to do that. We now ask about gender in a non-binary way. But that change had not come along before this study. And that change was not something we could do lightly because I went into all this detail about weighting. For weighting, we're using US Census Bureau parameters, and the federal data is still binary. And so we couldn't make that change until we could do some experiments and make sure that we had a new way of asking this question that would work and that we could line up with the federal data for weighting for methodological purposes. So it just took some time, and unfortunately, we didn't get there before the 2020 study went into the field. But if we were to do it again, we would ask about gender in a non-binary way. And Pew Research Center studies, again, all our studies now in the US, standardly ask about gender in a non-binary way. So I'm sorry, I regret that we hadn't made that change in time for this study. It was coming. It's something we've been working on for some time.
Sure, makes sense. All right, well, Alan Cooperman, Director of Religion Research at Pew Research Center, thank you so much for joining us and taking the time to go over all of this. Again, the study is in the comments along with the article, so you can take a look for yourself and pour through all 250 pages, but that's all we've got for now.
Yeah, if you print it out, don't drop it on your foot. It'll hurt. It's a big report. There's also an FAQ on our website and an interactive where you can go and answer some of the questions and see how you're like or unlike other American Jews. And we're going to keep on working on these data. It's all freely available on our website at pewresearch.org. And thank you for the forward for your good coverage. And Arno, great questions. I really, really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you, Alan.